Well, today we're going to be discussing more evidence for the existence of God in a roundabout way. This argument is slightly different than some of the other arguments we've looked at. Some of the other arguments have focused on maybe scientific data that points to God, logical, deductive arguments that conclude, therefore, God exists. Today we're going to look at a different kind of evidence. Actually, evidence based on historical data. Namely, we're going to look for historical evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Hear me, we're not just talking about historical evidence that some guy named Jesus existed. We're not just talking about historical evidence that Jesus was crucified and executed by the Roman government. No, we're talking about more than that. We're going to look at the historical data that shows that Jesus rose from the dead. So the historical argument for the resurrection argues that Jesus' resurrection actually happened. It's not just something that you have to accept just by blind faith. No, we have reason, good reason, historical reason to believe the resurrection actually happened, that it was a real event in history. Now here's the deal. If Jesus was raised from the dead, then we seem to have a miracle on our hands, right? David Hume said, dead men don't rise naturally. I think he's onto something. Dead men don't rise naturally. So if we have historical evidence that a dead man did rise from the dead, since they don't rise naturally, we've got a miracle. Now, let's talk about the laws of science. The laws of science describe how matter and energy behave, or the laws of nature. Matter and energy, how they behave. So if something happens at a time and place or in a situation, and according to the laws of science, it could not have happened, then this is a miracle. This seems to be what we mean by a miracle. At the very least, it's not a natural event. Something supernatural or other than nature has caused something to happen because it's naturally impossible. Now, there's a significant difference between scientific impossibilities and logical impossibilities, and it's vital to understand this difference. Just because something is scientifically impossible, it does not entail that it's logically impossible. And if you remember when we studied the ontological argument for the existence of God, we talked about what it means for God to be omnipotent. And that just simply means that God can do all things that are logically possible. So logical possibilities is much bigger and greater than scientific possibilities. This leads us to the historical argument for the existence of God. It goes like this. Premise 1. There are certain facts about Jesus that need an explanation. 2. The best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. 3. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then God exists. Conclusion. 4. Therefore, God exists. All right, this argument is valid. It's a valid argument. That means the structure is correct. So if the premises are true, or at least more probably true than false, then we have good reason to accept the conclusion. So since this is a valid argument, let's examine the premises. What about step 1? Is it true? Again, it says there are certain facts about Jesus that need an explanation. So, I believe this is a true premise. Let's see why. Now, this is a big section, so we're not going to, this is going to take a few episodes here, so stick with us and make sure you keep coming back. But we're going to take some time here examining some facts. But let's talk about a scholar. What is a scholar? Well, a scholar is someone whose job it is to study, and to study hard, especially on a particular topic. scholars usually work at universities or free-thinking ministries. Just kidding. Okay, I try to be scholarly in my studies. Now, there are many types of scholars. Scholars who study history are called historians. Scholars are usually experts on their subjects. Now, historians who study the New Testament are, big surprise, called New Testament historians. Now, it's important to note that one does not have to be a Christian to be a New Testament historian. In fact, there are atheists out there who are also New Testament historians. So it doesn't follow that just because somebody is a New Testament historian that they must be a Christian. You got to understand that. There are atheists who are New Testament historians and scholars. Now, New Testament historians study the New Testament as if it were a normal ancient work. They don't have to presuppose that the Bible is the inspired Word of God or that there's anything special about it. Right? They just, this is easy to comprehend when you realize that there's atheists who are New Testament scholars. Of course, they don't believe, since they don't believe in God, they don't believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. They just see it as another old ancient writing, and they're going to study it just as if they were going to study any other ancient writings. You know, even historians who are Christians, like Mike Licona, he makes a practice of this. When he's a New Testament scholar, a New Testament historian. And so when he studies the New Testament, even though he is a Christian and he believes that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, he kind of brackets that belief. You know, while he's in the lab, so to speak, he treats the New Testament just as he would any other writing. So there are many other ancient works written thousands of years ago, for example, by Plato and Plutarch and Aristotle and Homer. But a good New Testament historian, when doing that job, when simply being a historian, you know, like I said, while in the lab, kind of brackets his beliefs that the Bible is the inspired Word of God when he studies the New Testament. Now, all New Testament historians, whether they be atheists or Christians or anywhere in between, believe that our copy of the New Testament is excellent. Now, that's important to understand that they don't think that the Bible just does really well according to some standard. No, the Bible sets the standard in which all other ancient writings hope to come close to approximating, but usually fall far short from doing so. The Bible, especially the New Testament, sets the standard. Now, our copy of the New Testament is at least 97% close to the original writings. Okay? At least 97% accurate to the original autographs. The other 3% are small differences that don't really matter. It's in the peripheral details. It doesn't affect the core of the major story or the major things reported. These are just small little peripheral details that don't really matter. Now, there are more than 20,000, let me say that again, more than 20,000 copies or parts of copies of the New Testament, some of which are very old. And that number is growing as archaeologists discover more. So, over 20,000 copies of early copies of the original documents. And that number is growing. They're finding more all the time. Now, that's 20,000 and counting. The next ancient work with the most number of early copies is the Iliad of Homer. Guess how many copies we have of that? 650. So, all right, over 20,000 copies of the New Testament and 650 of the next best writing. Which would you rather have? Over 20,000 or 650? The answer is obvious. Now, all New Testament historians believe that there's lots of things in the New Testament that really did happen. Even the atheists who are New Testament historians would agree on that much, right? They might not agree. They might not think the virgin birth really occurred, or that Jesus actually walked on water or turned water into wine. They might not think any of that is true, but they will say that there are events in the New Testament that are historical and that really happened. Parts of the New Testament come from a few years after Jesus' death, or they're written a few years after Jesus' death. And, for example, Paul's letters, right, were just written a few years after the execution of Jesus. Others were written a few decades after Jesus' death, like the Gospels. Important to note here that just because the Bible starts out with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then goes to Acts and then Romans and gets to Paul's writings, that's not in order, at least in the way it was actually written. Paul wrote first, and the Gospels followed Paul. Just something good to know. I didn't realize that until I was probably in my late 20s. That was just a couple years ago. Just kidding. Okay. So check this out. People who saw Jesus are called eyewitnesses. All right, so people who saw Jesus, the eyewitnesses, were still alive during the time of these writings, all these writings, from a few years after that Paul wrote to the decades after in the Gospels. The people were still alive that saw Jesus. By contrast, the earliest writings regarding Alexander the Great, for example, come nearly 400 years after he died. So the people that were eyewitnesses of Alexander the Great were not still around when those writings were around. But nobody's doubting Alexander the Great's existence or the things he did, right? But what would you rather have? A few short years or 400 years? Why are we inconsistent? Why do so many people think we can't believe the things about Jesus when it's just a few years after his death, when nobody has a problem with things written about Alexander the Great 400 years after his death? The New Testament is similar to works of history written by other ancient historians, like Plutarch, Josephus, Tacitus, and others. All right, let's continue examining the facts. Here's some facts that most New Testament historians agree on, even non-Christian and atheistic scholars. Fact number 1. There was a Jewish man called Jesus who lived in Israel around AD 30. I got to tell you, the evidence for Jesus' existence is as good for the evidence of the existence of Julius Caesar, who everyone agrees existed. Nobody's doubting that. Now, I got to tell you, there's a handful of people out there known as Jesus mythers, right? And they say that Jesus didn't even exist. Now, let me read to you what Bart Ehrman, who is a New Testament scholar, and he thinks that atheism's probably true, right? He leans heavily towards atheism. Bart Ehrman was, I think he won some award, and then during the Q&A session, a questioner from the audience said, "I don't see any historical evidence for the existence of Jesus." And let me tell you how Bart Ehrman responded. Let's grab my laptop here. Bart Ehrman says this: "Well, I do. I mean, that's why I wrote the book. I have a whole book on it. There is a lot of evidence. There's so much evidence." He's talking about the existence of Jesus. He says, "I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there is nobody. I mean, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity." He repeats himself. "It is not an issue for scholars of antiquity," he says. He goes on, "There is no scholar at any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed. Now, that's not evidence, he says. Just because everybody thinks so doesn't make it evidence. I would clarify, it doesn't make it true. But he goes on. He says, but if you want to know about the theory of evolution versus the theory of creationism, and every scholar at every reputable institution in the world believes in evolution, it may not be evidence, but if you've got a different opinion, you had better have a pretty good piece of evidence yourself. He goes on. The reason for thinking that Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. That's why. And I give the details in my book. Early and independent sources indicate that certainly Jesus existed. One author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He's an eyewitness to both Jesus' closest disciple and his brother. So, Bart Ehrman says, I'm sorry, I respect your disbelief. But if you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish. End quote. So that's just a fantastic, Bart Ehrman just excoriates his fellow atheist here, saying, look, we can't be mythical. He's saying, look, I know you guys want to just believe, have this blind faith that Jesus didn't exist because it makes our job easier, really, when arguing against the evidence for the resurrection. But he says, you can't do that. You just look foolish. So, anyway, let's continue. That's fact number one. We have really good reason to believe that some guy named Jesus of Nazareth really lived around AD 30. Fact number two. Jesus thought he was special. He thought there was something special about him. And we can tell this by what he said and the things he did. Now, if you just read the Gospels, you find that Jesus claimed to represent God. He thought that he was the Messiah and God's Son. Now, this is an accepted fact. And so, guys like Bart Ehrman aren't going to say, well, Jesus really was special, or he really was the Son of God. They don't believe that. But they will say, but Jesus really thought he was. Okay, that's a historical fact. Now, if Jesus did not say these things, it's hard to see why the early church would believe that he was the Messiah or Christ and the Son of God. That's why in Paul's letters, whenever you see Jesus, you almost always see Christ following Jesus. So Christ just means God's anointed one or the Messiah. Yeah, surprise, surprise. Contrary to popular belief, Christ is not the last name of Jesus. I just found that out a couple days ago. Just kidding. Okay. Most historians acknowledge this too, that Jesus thought he was the Son of God, and so did the early church. Right? Again, hear me. Historians are not all saying that Jesus really was the Son of God, but they're saying that Jesus thought he was, and so did the early church. Okay? Fact number three. Jesus had a number of disciples, both men and women, who were Jews. And this is how the church grew. All right? It was much more than just the core of, the 12 disciples. That was the core of his disciples. Kind of the inner circle, if you will. But he had many followers and disciples, both men and women. All right. Fact number 4. Jesus was crucified as a criminal by the Roman authorities, and he died on the cross. It's not really disputed. Fact number 5. Jesus' body was buried in a tomb in Jerusalem. Most scholars and historians will agree to that. Fact number 6. Some of Jesus' women disciples, said they discovered his tomb empty And B said they saw the resurrected, risen Jesus. Now, with that said, it's important to note that the stories of the women sometimes seem to be slightly different between the different Gospels. For example, Mark 16:2 and John 20, verse 1 seem to be kind of at odds with each other. They seem to be kind of contradictory. Mark 16:5 and Luke 24:4 there seems to be an apparent contradiction there. So is this a problem? No, it's not a problem. I mean, think about it. This happens all the time when different eyewitnesses see the same thing. A few years ago, I was in a car wreck in an intersection. Now, I got to tell you, I sincerely thought it was the other person's fault. They thought it was my fault. And guess what? There was a lot of eyewitnesses around that intersection at the time. The police went to interview all of them. They all had conflicting eyewitness testimonies. Right? Some people said it was my fault. Other people said it was her fault. So they finally chalked it up to a no fault, right? Because they just couldn't figure it out. Now, did it mean they were lying? That somebody was lying? No, not necessarily. It just means people saw the same thing happen in a different way. Now, nobody denied the main thing. There was a car wreck in the intersection. And nobody thought, well, since this eyewitness is saying that it's Tim's fault, this eyewitness is saying it's this other person's fault, I guess the wreck didn't happen. No, it doesn't work that way. You know, the famous detective, J. Warner Wallace, who I think NBC Nightline referred to him as the evidence whisperer. Because this guy, I mean, he's a famous detective. He solves these cold case murders that nobody else can solve. The case is cold, it's closed. They give it to J. Warner Wallace, and he solves the cases over and over again. He's awesome at this. He's a Christian too, by the way, a former atheist who examined all the data, all the historical data, and came to become a Christian. But here's what J. Warner Wallace says. He, as a detective, when he's interrogating eyewitnesses, or interviewing eyewitnesses, I should say, he becomes suspicious if all the eyewitnesses offer the exact same testimony, especially if it's in the exact wording. It seems like, you know, as a detective, if everybody's got the exact same story, somebody has been working a little too hard to get their story straight. So he expects, as a detective, to find some slight differences, perhaps even contradictions in the peripheral details when the main part of the story is the same. Okay? So it's actually something that, according to Wallace, should make us think the Gospels are even more believable. So anyway, back then in the day, this is important too, 2,000 years ago or so, people thought women were not good witnesses, at least compared to men. That is, if someone wanted to make up a story about, a fictional story about the resurrected Jesus, it would be more believable to at least that culture, who they're trying to convince at the time. It would be far more believable to say that men were the first ones who saw the risen Jesus. But all the Gospels say it was women. But again, in that time and culture, women were not considered to be reliable. So why, if you're just making the story up, would you say it was women? Unless it was just the truth that the women were the ones that saw him first. Now let's continue looking at more facts. So far, we've looked at 6. Here's the 7th. Jesus' male disciples they really believed that Jesus had really risen from the dead. And so really was the Son of God, the Messiah. And they were willing to die for this belief. Okay, so it's important to note that these scholars, even the atheists who were scholars here, They're not saying that Jesus really did rise from the dead. They're just saying that it's a historical fact that his disciples really did believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay? We'll discuss that more soon. But that is, they believed that, or the scholars would say that the disciples said they really saw him and touched him, and they ate with him. They experienced Jesus with their five senses. They thought they saw him at many different times and places. And they kept preaching that Jesus was risen, even though it was really dangerous to do so. I mean, they had many enemies back then. Many Jews and their leaders who wanted to shut them up. I mean, they were opposed to free speech, right? They did not want this free speech. They wanted to shut them up. They'd already killed Jesus, and it was dangerous for his followers, especially if you're going to keep preaching about Jesus. It was really dangerous, and they wanted to silence them. And after some years, the Roman government also began to persecute Christians. For example, do some research on the Emperor Nero, right? So it was very dangerous. It was like, imagine if you're a Christian today in Pakistan or, I don't know, some Middle East hardcore Muslim nation who, where if you speak against Allah or Muhammad, I mean, they will kill you, right? If you say that Jesus is God, they will cut your head off. I mean, imagine living in that kind of a culture. It was very dangerous for the disciples to keep preaching about Jesus in this culture back then. Now, some disciples did die for their beliefs. For example, James, the brother of John, and James, the brother of Jesus. And actually, we know about James, the brother of Jesus, and how he died, not from the Bible or any other Christian writings, but from extra-biblical sources written by non-Christians. So, and we have good reason to believe that Peter was executed for his belief. For more on this, I encourage you to get Sean McDowell's book. I think it's called The Fate of the Disciples. It's actually his PhD dissertation. Really encourage you to get his book and to look at all the historical research he did on the fate of the disciples. Now, people started worshiping Jesus because the disciples first said they saw him, not the other way around. All right, so let's look at fact number 8. There was a Pharisee. The Pharisees were the group of people that had Jesus killed, okay? So in this group now, there's a Pharisee named Saul, who later came to be known as Paul. And now Saul persecuted the Christians at the time. This is after the crucifixion, when Jesus isn't around anymore, okay? But all the disciples are telling people that Jesus was raised from the dead. And so Paul was I should say Saul, the Christian hunter, right? He would hunt down the Christians. He would arrest them and possibly even have them executed. He was the Christian hunter who persecuted followers of Christ. But suddenly, and out of seemingly nowhere, Saul changed. Saul became Paul. And he stopped hunting down Christians to persecute them. And all of a sudden just said, hey, I'm going to join that team. Right? I'm going to join the very people I'm trying to persecute. The people I'm trying to kill, well, now I'm going to go join those people so others can try to kill me too. What? Why would he do such a thing? Paul suddenly changed his mind and became a Christian for the rest of his life. Why? Well, it's because Paul said that he saw and experienced the risen Jesus. He saw Jesus, he says, and believed that Jesus rose from the dead. That's why he changed. And this is recognized as a historical fact. Again, not all the scholars are going to say that Paul or Saul really did see Jesus, the risen Jesus, and then became Paul. but they will say that Saul really thought he had experienced the risen Jesus and then transformed into Paul, the Jesus follower named Paul. So, because of this, Paul was willing to die for Jesus, and he did. All right. Now, facts 6, 7, and 8 need an explanation. Why did these odd things happen? Now, to do this, we've got to tell a story. We've got to tell a story that makes sense of all of these facts, these historical facts. And it's not just any old story. No, this story needs to be coherent. It needs to make sense. So this is what part of the historical method is all about. You take the facts, and then you try to... It's like being a detective, really. So let's be good detectives right now. Let's put on our detective hats, get our magnifying glasses out, and examine the data. You know, this reminds me of James Warner Wallace. He is recognized as one of the greatest detectives in our nation, probably in the world today. He solves these cold cases, these cold case murders. And he does this by looking at all the facts. And then he puts together a reasonable story showing what probably really did happen. So, this is part of the historical method. And so, step 1 was just understanding the facts. Now let's discuss step 2. That is, how do we explain these facts? All right, I've got the facts up here on the board. I hope you can see them. Right? And so the question is raised, why did the women say they found Jesus' tomb empty? I mean, it's a historical fact that the women said they found the tomb of Jesus empty. Well, we're going to look at some options here. Here's the other one. Why did the disciples think and behave the way they did? We're going to look at that. And then why did Saul become Paul? Why are all these things going on? We have to create a story. We have to put these pieces together and make a coherent story that makes sense of all the data. All right, what's some options here that would make sense of why the women said they found Jesus' tomb empty? Well, one, it could just be because they were confused. People get confused all the time. So that could be an option. Perhaps it was they were lying, right? They wanted to deceive people. We know people can lie, so that's a possibility. It's also possible that, hey, they just went to the wrong tomb. There must have been lots of tombs like this around the town, and they just went to the wrong place. They went to the wrong address. I've done that before. Not a big deal. Or it could be that the tomb really was empty. You got to consider that. All right, well, those are some options to consider. We put all those on the table. And let's move on to the next one. Why did the disciples think and behave the way they did? Good question. Well, let's think of the most plausible possible answers. All right, one, they just really wanted it to be true. They really wanted to believe in Jesus, and that's it. All right, we'll consider that. Well, what about 2? They were also lying, just like those women. Just a big lie. Or 3, Jesus never really died. Right? He might have got beat up, might have been crucified, but he survived it somehow. It's a possibility. All right, the next one. Well, somebody tricked them. They got fooled. Right? Pranksters. Got punked. Oh, this one. They were hallucinating, right? Have you ever had a hallucination? Right? I mean, some of you, probably have more than others. Don't know why. But, I can think of an easy one. On a hot summer day, you're driving down the highway or the interstate, and it looks like there's water up there. I remember when I was a little kid, my mom said, "Hey, Tim," we were in our VW bus going down the highway. Big red VW bus back in the late 70s probably. And she's like, "Tim, look at all that water up there." I was like, "Whoa, Why is it so wet up there? And we got, I thought we were getting closer and closer, but the water never got closer and closer. And then pretty soon she told me, hey, this is an illusion. It's kind of like a hallucination. Maybe not exactly the same thing, but, our eyes can fool us, right? Well, maybe they just hallucinated and they all thought they saw Jesus, but they didn't really see him. All right, that's something to consider. Well, finally, the other option is, they were right. Jesus really did rise from the dead. They saw the resurrected Jesus and experienced him. You got to consider that as a possible option. All right. Why did Saul behave the way he did? That is to say, why did Saul become Paul? Well, let's consider those options. Saul was stupid. Okay, maybe that's one. Or Saul was lying. You got to consider that. Or 3, some other Christians tricked Saul. They punked Saul. They got him good. Or 4, well, Saul just felt really guilty, right? He'd been persecuting these poor Christians, hunting them down, arresting them, torturing them. Some of them were getting killed. And all of a sudden he just felt this tremendous guilt. And because he was feeling so much guilt, just thought, gosh, I better go join that team so I can get persecuted too. All right, let's consider that. Or here's the hallucination again. Maybe that happened to Paul too, right? Just like everybody else is having these hallucinations of Jesus. Well, join the club, Paul. Have a hallucination of yourself. Possible. Or finally, Saul really did see Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, just as he claimed. And that's why Saul became Paul. Well, let's consider these things. Now, we can pick one or more options from each part and try to tell a story. And these are most of the options that people, non-Christians and Christians, have thought about over the years. And when I say over the years, I'm really talking about the last 2,000 years or so. But these are really the majority of the options that people offer. Now, we can make up lots of stories to try to fit these facts together. Some of these stories will be much more believable than others. And many stories are possible. But we want a story that's not just possible, not just possibly true. We want a story that seems probably true. You see, possibilities come cheap, but probabilities, those are much more expensive. Well, next, we're going to try to cross out some of these more unbelievable stories, these hard to believe options. So again, let's put on our detective hat like J. Warner Wallace and examine the data, examine the evidence, examine the clues, and try to put together the most believable story. Well, we saw that to tell a story, a coherent story, regarding facts 6, 7, and 8, or at least that's the job that we're trying to do. We're trying to tell a coherent story that makes sense of all these facts on the board behind me. To do this, we can choose from some options to explain each fact and then try to make a story. Now, a story might be good at explaining one fact, but terrible at explaining the others. And there are many options, but we now eliminate some of them as more unbelievable than others. This is regarding the inference to the best explanation, a story that explains all the facts. Now, you just consider, we gave you many facts. We're just looking at 3 right now. But if you look at these facts, let's say, well, we can tell a story that explains this. And so you pick, say you pick number 2 here. And you try to tell a story about why it was that the women said the tomb was empty. And you just say, well, it's because they're lying. Well, that makes sense of this. But when you start trying to use that explanation for this one, does that make sense? We're going to look at why it doesn't, and especially when we get to this one. Is that going to really make good sense? We'll continue. Hang with me here. So you might have a story that explains one fact, but if it doesn't explain the other two, it's not really a good explanation. Maybe you've got a story that explains two of the three facts. Well, hey, that's a better explanation than the one that only explains one fact. But if it doesn't explain all the facts, then it's not going to be as good as a story or an explanation that can explain all the facts. If you have an explanation that can explain all the facts, then that's the inference to the best explanation. So let's continue. Let's look at fact number 6. Why did the women say they found Jesus' tomb empty? Well, a story that does not use number 4, the empty tomb, is going to be really hard to believe. If there was any dead body in the tomb, it would be really hard to explain facts 6 and 7. Think about it. If the tomb was not empty, how would you explain these two? If there was not a dead body in the tomb, then those other two don't make sense. For a Jew back in that day, the idea of resurrection obviously meant the body was not dead anymore. That's how you got to go back to their time and what a Jew would believe in that time. And for resurrection, they believed that meant the body was not dead. So, how could the disciples, 1, get the idea that Jesus was resurrected, and 2, expect anyone to believe them, and 3, be willing to die for this? That's not a good explanation. Someone must have gone to the tomb and checked. Now, I'll tell you what, if I went to somebody's funeral, and then 2-3 days later, people are telling me that same person who I saw get buried in the ground is now walking around town, and I haven't seen them myself, I'll tell you what, even if I did see them, I'd want to go to the tomb or the grave, right? I want to go to the cemetery where I saw them buried, and I want to go see if there's a body in that coffin, in that gravesite. I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but that's the first thing I would want to do. And why would anyone want to invent this story unless it actually happened? And I said it, I think last time, people back then also didn't think that women were good witnesses, and there were at least 5 women reported to have gone to the tomb. It would have been easy to see if the tomb still had a body in it. So it's hard to believe that they were just confused. There was no reason for them to lie, and no one else would have believed them anyway. If they went to the wrong tomb, other disciples and enemies would definitely have said so. I mean, that's what I would have done if I was one of their enemies. If somebody starts, if I was on the other team, so to speak, if I was one of the Pharisees, and I saw these people who were following Jesus, we just killed Jesus, and now they're running around town saying that Jesus is not dead, that we failed in our mission to kill Jesus. First thing I'm going to go do is show them that dead body. Again, not the sharpest tool in the shed, but that's the first thing I'd do. All right, let's discuss fact number 8. Why did Saul become Paul? Why did Saul behave the way he did? Now, any story that that uses 1, 2, 3, or 4 is going to be really hard to believe. Saul was not stupid. He was an intelligent and educated Pharisee. He wouldn't change his mind just for no reason. There's absolutely no reason for him to lie either. He was fiercely persecuting the Christians. Why would he just change his mind all of a sudden? In those days, it was really dangerous to be a Christian. 1, there were not many Christians in the first place, and 2, most Jews rejected them and thought they were shameful, and so did Saul, I should say, before he became Paul. There was no way Christians could have found a way to trick Saul into joining them either. I mean, I don't want to say no way, but it seems really hard to believe that you could punk Saul and trick him like that. There's also no reason to think that Saul felt guilty, right? He really believed in what he was doing, right? He thought that Jesus was a false Messiah that deserved to be executed, and that they demonstrated that he was false, that he was a fake, by killing him. And now he's got a few of his disciples running around saying he's not dead. Well, he wants to destroy this budding cult, if you will, this cult of Judaism. And he wants to destroy this thing. He's going after him. He believed what they were doing was wrong. He believed what he was doing was the right thing by hunting down Christians. Also, option 5, the hallucination option, is hard to believe. But we're not going to cross it out just yet. I'm going to spend some more time on it later. But, just in passing right now, just let me say this. There's no other example that we know of where a vicious enemy has, 1, had a hallucination, 2, then suddenly decides to go to the other side because of this hallucination, and then 3, becomes willing to die for this hallucination. So we need a better explanation. Now, I just watched a debate last night between Mike Licona and Bart Ehrman, and I believe that I think Bart in the debate last night actually said that he believes that all these people really believed that they saw the risen Jesus. He says it's a historical fact, but he says they were just hallucinating. Is that a good explanation? Well, we're going to continue talking about that. Let's look at fact number 7. Why did the disciples think and behave the way they did? That's a good question. Why did they do that? Well, let's look at a story. Let's try to make a story here using option 1. They really wanted this to be true, okay? So Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. There's nothing special about why the disciples did what they did. They just wanted to believe so much in Jesus. Actually, they wanted to believe in Jesus' teachings. They loved his teachings. They wanted those teachings to be true. So much so that they were willing to die for it. Like suicide bombers also die all the time for what they believe in today. Well, this does not explain fact 7 or the other facts. The disciples said they really saw and met Jesus alive. This is what they were willing to die for, not the teachings of Jesus. They weren't willing to die for Jesus' teachings. They were willing to die for the fact that they said, hey, he was dead and now he's alive. That's what they were willing to die for. Not just Jesus' teachings. And they had to have very good reasons to do what they did. Now let's try to use a story using option 2 here. And they would say this. Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, and the disciples knew it. But some or all of them stole Jesus' body. And after that, well, that's why they behaved the way they did. Well, this story, this option, this story explains fact 6, but it's terrible at explaining 7 or even 8. Why would anyone be willing to die for a lie? Especially if you know it's a lie. I mean, at least the Islamic terrorists that blow themselves up or fly airplanes into buildings today, they sacrifice themselves. They're willing to die for a lie, but it's a lie they really believe is true. But there's something different about the disciples here. They would be in a position to know if this was a lie or not, unlike modern day terrorists. So there's a big difference here. So why would anyone be willing to die for a lie, especially if you know it's a lie? The disciples must have believed they really saw Jesus. That's a better explanation. The disciples knew what they did was very dangerous, but they kept on doing it. Even though, one, they knew not many would believe him anyway, and two, some of them had been killed for it. And it was likely that they would be killed for what they were testifying to as well. Well, let's use a story using option 3 here. Let's try to make sense of this. And some have said this. Well, Jesus never actually died, they say. He just woke up in the tomb. He survived the crucifixion, maybe barely, but then they put him in the tomb and he survived and he got out. And when the disciples then saw him, well, they were amazed. And they did what they did in fact 7 then, because they were amazed that Jesus survived. No one thinks that this is a good explanation these days. Some people did around 200 years ago. This was really purported and offered as a way to make sense of these historical, of this fact, apart from the resurrection. So no scholar really believes this today. Now, tell that to some internet atheists who don't seem to have received that memo yet. But and so I still, in my interaction with atheists online and on the college campus, I'll still hear uninformed atheists, if you will, try to offer this as an explanation. But no scholar holds this today. The Romans were very good at executing criminals. Execution was like an art form to them. They had it down to a science. So Jesus never could have survived. Nobody really thinks he could have survived. Now, even if he did, think about the mess that Jesus' body would have been in. Anybody that has seen Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, I mean, just think about the mess that Jesus' body was in. I mean, he was beaten to a pulp. If he wasn't crucified on the cross, he would have probably eventually died just from the beating he took before he got to the cross. It was amazing what the Romans would do, the executioners of the day. They had execution down to a science, and they were proud of their work, and they took it seriously. But even if Jesus survived at the cross somehow, his body would have been an utter mess, to put it lightly. The disciples would never have believed that Jesus really resurrected from the dead and therefore worshipped him, or be willing to die to tell people about it. I mean, think about this. First of all, if anything, they wouldn't be going out telling people, risking their lives to tell people that Jesus rose from the dead. No, they'd be looking for a doctor. And imagine if somehow Jesus survived and woke up in the tomb and somehow rolled the stone away on his own. I mean, think about that. You're beat down by the Roman executioners. Your wrists and your feet are pierced, and somehow you survive the crucifixion, which seems very unlikely. But somehow you survive, and then you throw him, and due to the coolness of the tomb, without any food or water, that coolness of the tomb revives him. Man, why do we even have hospitals today? Just throw people in cool tombs. They'll be all right in 3 days. Now, so imagine that Jesus somehow survives, rolls the stone away, and then starts walking back into town. He's got to hurt. I can't imagine what that feels like. And nobody sees him walking through town, but he eventually gets to where the disciples are hanging out, knocks on the door. That's got to hurt. And then they open the door, and they see Jesus, this mess. He looks like a zombie. And would Jesus say, "Here, touch this and see that I've been raised"? Or when they touch it, I can see him say, "Ouch, that hurts." Right? I can't remember who first, was it Mike Lacona first said that? I can't remember. It's not mine, didn't make that up. But, they're not going to worship this guy. They're going to be like, "Wow, crazy that you survived, Jesus. Now let's hide you so they don't kill you. And man, let's be quiet ourselves because look what they did to you. I don't want that happening to me." Right? So they're not going to go out and share this in the streets. Right? They're going to be quiet. Yeah, it would have been basically a miracle that he survived. But you're not going to go out and tell people that he rose from the dead. You don't want that same thing happening to you. It's not a good explanation. And that's why no scholar today that I'm aware of would offer it. All right, let's try to use a story using option 4. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. No, he had an identical twin brother. A twin brother. Who knew, right? But Jesus, yeah, he had a twin brother. Possible, right? Is it logically possible? Sure. He had a twin brother. Nobody knew about this twin brother. But then this brother, this tricky guy, he stole Jesus' body. I mean, he's been watching this whole thing, watching Jesus' ministry from the shadows for many, for 3 years. Never really getting to know anybody, just lurking around, right? Watching everything Jesus is doing, this twin brother. And then they kill him, and he gets the idea, well, I'm going to steal his body and then tell everybody that I'm back. I'm Jesus, and I've returned. Great idea. So, this twin brother stole Jesus' body from the tomb and pretended that he was Jesus to the disciples. Now, if you think this is crazy, guess what? This has been offered as a real option to consider. Anything but the resurrection. Please don't let Christianity be true. I mean, it would be horrible if Christianity was true, wouldn't it? I mean, that we should really love everybody from our neighbors to our enemies. Oh, horrible, horrible thing. Anything but Christianity, please. But no, let's not. If the resurrection is true, then that means that we should love all people from our neighbors to our enemies. So, since we don't want that, we don't want Jesus' teachings to be validated by the resurrection, well, maybe Jesus had a twin brother. But you see, that's not a good explanation because there's no evidence that Jesus had a twin brother. Number one, you got to make this up. This is called ad hoc. This is an ad hoc option here. You're just making it up. Making it up out of the blue. Is it possible? Sure. But like I said, possibilities come cheap and probabilities are much more expensive. We've got no reason to think that Jesus had a twin brother. And it would have been really hard to hide the fact that he had a twin brother from everybody. And why would anyone want to pretend to be a hated criminal that was just executed? Think about that. All right, his sneaky twin brother lurking around in the shadows all these years, watching what's going on, sees Jesus get executed. Again, go watch The Passion of the Christ to see how that went down. And then said, now I'm going to steal his body and claim to be the person they just executed. And if they find you, they're going to do the same thing to you. Would you do that if you were Jesus' twin brother? I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but I wouldn't do that. That's the last thing I would want to do. In fact, I would run. And if anybody asked me if I was related to Jesus, I'd say, Jesus who? If I was that twin brother. The twin would have also had to be incredibly good at pretending to fool all the disciples who had been around him for every day, every moment for the last 3 years. And stealing this body would have been really hard also. And after 40 days, after going around and making these appearances, after 40 days, now he's just gone. Where'd he go? Not a good explanation. So far, we've been trying to explain fact 7. And that is, why did the disciples think and behave the way they did? And also, this applies to why did Saul become Paul? We're trying to figure this out. We're saying, what's the inference and the best explanation here? Now, one of the most common explanations offered by skeptics, people who are skeptical of Christianity, skeptical of the resurrection of Jesus, they're trying to find another option to consider, anything but the resurrection. Well, the one that is commonly offered, whether it be in academia or on the internet or the local coffee shop, it's, hey, it was just a hallucination, right? It's just a hallucination. That's why the disciples behaved the way they did. They all had hallucinations, and that's why Paul Or that's why Saul became Paul, because he had a hallucination. So this is called the hallucination hypothesis. In fact, Mike Licona just debated Bart Ehrman last week on the reliability of the Gospels. I highly encourage everybody to watch that debate. Mike did great. But Bart Ehrman, I believe, even in that debate, affirmed that that is how he explains these things away, these historical facts. It's not a resurrection. No, they just all had hallucinations. Well, so here we go. The option that's commonly offered is that the disciples and Saul all hallucinated. They all had hallucinations, and that's why they all behaved the way they behaved. Now, these skeptics that offer this explanation, because they're skeptical of the resurrection, well, the first thing I want to ask is, why aren't you skeptical of your hallucination hypothesis? I think we should be skeptical of that hypothesis for good reason. Well, like I said, many non-Christians will say that this is what happened. But this is still very hard to believe. I mean, think about it. Before people hallucinate, they're usually really excited or expecting to see something. And the disciples here in this situation, they definitely were not excited, nor were they expecting to see anything. In fact, the opposite was true. They were afraid and they were grieving. Back then, no Jew would have imagined that the Messiah would be resurrected after execution as a common criminal. As N.T. Wright has suggested, he said, with the historical backdrop in mind back then, if your favorite Messiah got executed in a shameful manner by the government, well, you'd either get yourself a new Messiah or you'd go home. Back then, Jews believed that people would be resurrected only at the end of the world. So this is also why options 1, 2, 3, and 4 here on the board that we discussed in our previous episode are hard to believe. If Jesus was not resurrected, you got to ask yourself some questions. 1, where did the disciples get this strange idea? 2, why did they keep preaching it to the Jews even though they knew it would be extremely hard to believe? And on top of that, think about this. It's extremely difficult for many different people to hallucinate the same thing, especially at different times. I mean, it's crazy to think about that, or to suggest that that's actually what occurred. Hallucinations are just in your mind. For two people to share a hallucination would be like two people sharing the same dream. Mike Licona offers this analogy. He's like, suppose that I woke up in the middle of the night and I had a great dream that my wife and I were in Hawaii together. And so he says, so I wake up my wife, Debbie, and Mike's saying this, and I wake her up and I'm telling her about this dream that I had where we're in Hawaii on this great vacation. And she said, well, I'm having the exact same dream. Why'd you wake me up? And then Mike's like, well, let's go back to sleep and get a free vacation out of the dinner, right? So, no, that's ridiculous. But to say that people were all experiencing the same subjective hallucination is also absurd. It's not a good explanation. And the disciples weren't that stupid. They were willing to die for saying that they saw Jesus. So they had to be very sure that it wasn't just a dream. And of course they knew about dreams. So the question is raised, how did the tomb get empty? Even if the disciples did have hallucinations of Jesus, the question still remains, what about the tomb? Right? If everybody's having this hallucination, you would still go check out that tomb. How come it's empty? Even if the disciples did have hallucinations of Jesus, that doesn't explain what happened to his body. The disciples still would not have gotten the idea that Jesus was resurrected. It would have been far easier to think that Jesus went to heaven And instead, something like Elijah or something like that. Remember what we said about what the Jews believed back then. The resurrection would happen at the end of the world, was what they believed. So this, again, is why options 1, 2, 3, and 4 are hard to believe. Again, the options we discussed in our previous episode. So, since the hallucination hypothesis fails, it's not a good one, what's left to consider? Well, here's one. Regarding facts 7 and 8, they really did see Jesus alive again soon. Now, let's not call it resurrection yet, because many skeptics will say, yeah, the disciples did see Jesus alive after the crucifixion, after the cross. Some skeptics are willing to admit that much, and that all of the evidence suggests that they did, in fact, see the real Jesus after the crucifixion. But hey, anything but a resurrection. That's the one thing they can't have. Because if the resurrection is true, that is, if God raised Jesus from the dead, then Christianity is true. So anything but a resurrection. So let's try to explain this away in some other manner. Well, they'll say, well, yeah, they saw Jesus, but Jesus' body just naturally came back to life by itself. And that's it. Yeah, that's the ticket. God didn't do it. It just happened naturally. Well, they'll say, after all, it's logically possible. There's no logical contradiction with that statement. But that's still crazy because scientists know a lot about how human cells work, how cells die and decay. It seems naturally impossible for Jesus' body to come back to life after 3 days, just like that. We need an explanation other than nature. And that just means we need a supernatural explanation because, as David Hume said, dead men don't rise naturally. So we need a better explanation. And if we have a supernatural explanation, well, it seems that the best explanation of that would be we have a miracle on our hands. God raised Jesus from the dead. So, also consider this. Out of all the dead bodies that have ever existed, wouldn't it be quite strange that it happens to be Jesus at that time and place? Jesus' body that naturally came back to life. The timing of such an unlikely event is a little too coincidental, don't you think? Well, why? Because of what Jesus also said, that he represented God and so has power over life and death. Again, anything but a resurrection. Consider another claim. That one doesn't work. Let's consider another hypothesis to consider. This one is commonly offered, that very smart and intelligent and powerful aliens raised Jesus from the dead. So we have a resurrection, but God didn't do it. No, aliens did it. Yeah, that's the ticket. It's easier to believe in that than God raising Jesus from the dead. Anything but a resurrection. But you see, there's no evidence that aliens exist. We got to make that up. We got to make up this explanation. That means it's an ad hoc explanation and not to be preferred. Now, even if aliens did exist, it's possible they exist. But even if they did exist, they would have to be incredibly lucky to find our planet. This little blue, the pale blue dot in the middle of this vast universe. And they'd have to find us, first of all. So they'd have to be incredibly lucky to find our planet at the right time because this universe is so huge. It's probably impossible to travel very far in outer space anyway. And just let me say that many things that we see in movies are probably scientifically impossible. And that makes me sad because it seems like, according to the best physicists out there, lightsabers are scientifically impossible. I know. Bummer, because I really want a lightsaber someday. I've been wanting a lightsaber since I was 4, So come on, let's try to invent this thing. I don't want to accept that it's scientifically impossible. Not quite yet. All right. So anyway, back to Jesus. Even if these aliens, back to aliens, I should say. Even if these aliens did find our planet, why would they even have noticed Jesus? Why would they care about Jesus if these aliens happen to exist? Even if they did notice Jesus, why would they care about this crazy man in the middle of nowhere? And even if they did care for some weird reason, they wouldn't probably have the technology to raise him from the dead, because we already discussed why it's probably, at least scientifically, impossible for a dead man to be raised after, considering what happens to your cells, what scientists know about cells. So it's just not a good explanation at all. Is it logically possible? Sure. Is it a good explanation? No. So this is actually offered as a way to try to make sense of the historical facts. People realize, we've got historical facts that point to the resurrection. So these folks will go to the extreme and say, a resurrection occurred, but it wasn't God raising Jesus from the dead. Anything but that, because we can't have Christianity be true. So it's aliens that did it. Come on, we need a better explanation. Anything but a resurrection. Well, then they'll offer this one sometimes. Well, there's another God, not the God of the Bible, but a God, let's call this God Gaga, the Gaga God, right? And Gaga is a divine being who just loves to trick people. So he raised Jesus from the dead to punk you all, right? he punked us. He raised Jesus from the dead, but that's just, that's absurd. There's absolutely no evidence that a God called Gaga exists. You just had to make it up to explain this away, because you don't want Christianity to be true. You had to make up Gaga. There's no evidence for Gaga. And even if Gaga did exist, or, why would he care about Jesus or what Jesus said? Jesus said that he represented God, Yahweh, capital G God, right? Jesus said he represented God, so other gods with little g's would have no reason to raise Jesus from the dead. Where's the evidence that God loves tricking, or that Gaga would love tricking people also? That's ad hoc. And with this in mind, you can just use this Gaga explanation to explain just about anything. So it's, just not a good explanation. Anything but a resurrection. Anything but God raising Jesus from the dead. The God of the Bible raising Jesus from the dead. Well, let's consider another option. Since these other options aren't good, let's consider this one. That the God revealed by Jesus in the Bible exists, and that same God did raise Jesus from the dead. Let's consider that one, don't you think? All right, but wait, somebody might say, but aren't you just making up the idea of God like you did with Gaga? No. There's several reasons why that objection won't work, because we are allowed to use God as an explanation, Yahweh here, as an explanation, because part of the historical facts about Jesus was that he said he represented this God. So you got to take that into consideration. Plus, we've spent several months now going over all of the evidence for the existence of God, right? Independent arguments and independent evidence pointing to the existence of a God. From the Kalam cosmological argument to the Leibnizian argument from contingency, the moral argument, the fine-tuning argument pointing to the existence of God, the free-thinking argument, the ontological argument. Alan Planiga has noted that there's a couple dozen arguments or so for the existence of God. We have good reason, aside from the historical evidence, apart from this, that God exists. We don't have any other evidence for Gaga or aliens or anything like that, but we do have arguments and evidence for the existence of God. Now, unlike Gaga, we also don't have to make up a reason why God would want to raise Jesus. It really comes down to this. It all depends on whether Jesus was right about what he said. And if he was right, then it's easy to see that God would want to do a miracle like this to show people, to show humans, that Jesus was right, so that we would listen to him. We would have a divine stamp of approval, so to speak, on everything that Jesus said, taught, and exemplified. And by the way, Jesus summed that all up and said, hey, just get two things right. Love God and everybody love everybody. Who wouldn't want that to be true? It doesn't make sense to me why people would want to reject this and go out of their way to find another reason or another explanation when this one is clearly the best. God raised Jesus from the dead because he wants you to listen to Jesus, that you were created on purpose and for the specific purpose to know God and to love him and to be loved by him now and into the eternal future, and for everybody to love everybody from now into the eternal future. And if we would just listen to the teachings of Jesus, think about how much better this world would be right now. Well, God raised Jesus from the dead, so you listen to him. That's one reason. There's many others too. Anyway, the story of, I want you to consider the story of a guy who saw aliens, right? So, let's say he's on the news tonight and he's like, I just experienced these aliens from another planet. They came and they visited me, right? We probably think he was crazy. But he'd get mad because he's like, okay, why aren't you guys listening to me? Well, they told me that they're going to be here in 3 days. And then you'll believe me, and we're all laughing at him. Well, guess what? 3 days later, a whole fleet of starships from another planet comes to visit our planet. Would it make sense to say, just to jump to the conclusion, well, it can't be what the aliens he was talking about. It must be some other aliens. That guy was crazy. That doesn't make... No, the inference of the best explanation is that guy probably knew what he was talking about. Jesus was either right or he was wrong, based on the logical law of the excluded middle. Jesus was right or he was wrong. Anyway, we also do have evidence, like I said, that God exists. We've got those other arguments, the cumulative case. So it's not a stretch to say, man, the inference of the best explanation here is that God raised Jesus from the dead. That's the inference of the best explanation, especially since we've got independent arguments and evidence pointing to the existence of God. But even if we didn't have that evidence, this would still be the best explanation based upon what Jesus taught and based upon what Jesus said, just like the story of the guy who saw the aliens. So we've been looking at these historical facts. Now, we've laid out all these facts and said, now, we have to connect these dots. How do you fit this all these puzzle pieces to make a picture? Or how do you tell a story that's consistent with all of these facts? Now, some people don't want Christianity to be true. I've said it before, I don't understand why anybody wouldn't want the teachings of Jesus to be true. I mean, Jesus tells us that he represents God and that God wants everybody to love him in return because he loves you. And then he wants everybody to love everybody, even those who consider you an enemy. Love them. Desire the best for them. Jesus gives the parable of the Good Samaritan and says, go out of your way to make sure they flourish and prosper. I mean, can you imagine if everybody followed the teachings of Jesus? This would be an awesome place to live, much better than the place we live right now. But if we actually followed the teachings of Jesus, this would be a great place. It would be as close to heaven on earth as you can get. But some people really don't want Christianity to be true. They don't want it to be the case that God raised Jesus from the dead. And by the way, if God raised Jesus from the dead, I've said this before, but if God raised Jesus from the dead, then at least some flavor of Christianity is true. As C.S. Lewis called it, mere Christianity would be true. But if God did not raise Jesus from the dead, then Christianity is false. Paul says that much in the New Testament. So it really hinges on the fact that if God raised Jesus from the dead, then Christianity is true. At least some flavor of Christianity. So, we've looked at, here's my point. Some people don't want that to be true. They don't want Christianity to be true, and so they try to find another way to explain these historical facts, apart from the resurrection. Now, we've said that the resurrection hypothesis can make sense of all the facts, and even the ones that aren't on this board. Okay? So we've got all these historical facts, and the resurrection hypothesis can explain all of them. But others say, no, the resurrection can't be true, so they offer other possible explanations. But when you push on those explanations, they crumble quickly. And so we look on the board here, we look at everything from how can we explain some of these things? The women were confused, the disciples just really wanted it to be true, or there's some conspiracy theory going on here. They went to the wrong tomb. Aliens, we talk about aliens, Jesus had a twin brother, and the most common is, people were just hallucinating. But we've been looking at these possible explanations, and they fall apart. That is to say, they're not good explanations. Sure, maybe a hallucination might explain one, but it can't explain the other. Maybe an alien interfering or Jesus had a twin brother might explain one, but it can't explain the other facts. And so if you have an explanation that can, let's say you've got 5 facts that you need to explain, and you've got a possible explanation that can explain 2 facts, well, that's great. But then if you have another possible explanation that explains 3, then that's a better explanation than the one that explains 2. So you say the inference to the best explanation there is the one that can explain 3 of the 5 facts. But if you have an explanation that's possibly true, and it can explain all 5 of the facts, then the inference to the best explanation, given everything that we've examined, that's the one that can explain all the facts. So you pick that one. And I'm telling you, the resurrection hypothesis is the only one, after 2,000 years of looking for other possible answers, other possible explanations, the resurrection hypothesis is the one that can explain all of the facts. That is to say, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the inference to the best explanation after examining all of the historical facts. Let's review the argument I began this series with. It's a 3-step syllogism, or I should say, it's 3 premises leading to a final deductive conclusion. Let's take a look. Premise 1. There are some facts that need an explanation. 2. The best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. 3. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then God exists. Final step, deductive conclusion. Therefore, God exists. Okay, so we've got here an argument for the resurrection and for the existence of God in 4 simple steps. All right, we've addressed some possible objections in the past, in the last few episodes. So let's look now at some final potential problems. I've had this offered to me before. An atheist coming to me and saying, I don't care what you say. Jesus rising from the dead is a miracle. And the chances of a miracle happening are so small that it will always be easier to not believe the things that the disciples said. But the thing is, that's not a good explanation, because we've already looked carefully at the historical facts. I'm talking about chances. The chances of these historical facts being facts, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, are even smaller. Let me say that again. The chances of these historical facts, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, are even smaller. Think about those chances. What are the chances that we would have all this historical data pointing that the resurrection is the best explanation if the resurrection didn't happen? Think about those chances. So anyway, we've also seen that all of the other explanations are more difficult to believe. They're not good, and they can't make sense of all the facts. Be that as it may, this chance objection is just silly. When someone announces the winning lottery number on TV, well, the chance of that specific number being picked is extremely small. So, should we not believe him when he reads, say that he's reading the number on your ticket, right? And he's reading the number that you're holding, you're looking at it, and you're like, the chances of me winning the lottery are so small that surely I'm not going to believe it when he reads my number, saying that I should win the billions of dollars. No, that doesn't make any sense at all. The chance that he would announce that number, if it actually wasn't picked, is even smaller also. And plus, we've got no reason to think he's mistaken. So unless you have a good argument that he's mistaken when he reads this number, you shouldn't jump to the conclusion that he's wrong. Here's the bottom line. Something being improbable does not make something impossible. Right? So the resurrection is a possible hypothesis. It's a possible explanation. And it's the only one that can make sense of all the facts, even if one wants to say it's improbable. But improbable things happen all the time. Now, someone might say, also, well, we hear so many silly stories of ghosts and UFOs and monsters, like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, things like that, and all these other kinds of miracles. So Jesus rising from the dead is just another one of these silly stories, which we also shouldn't believe. But there's some glaring differences here with this resurrection hypothesis and these, Loch Ness Monster stories. Many ghost or miracle stories are different, or, alien stories. These are different kinds of things. The facts are usually not very good in these situations. The facts are usually pretty sketchy. And typically, people are expecting to see something, right? I mean, you'll have these TV shows of people going out and looking for Bigfoot. And what do you know? I think I just got a glimpse of him. Well, they're hoping to see it. They're wanting to see it. They're expecting to see it. They're going out to find him, right? And then these are the people that you usually see. Yeah, I'm sure I saw something. Yeah, that's it. So they're expecting to see it. The disciples weren't in that situation at all. They saw Jesus dead. Paul definitely wasn't expecting it, right? He's the wild card in this whole thing. Paul would be the last person who would expect to see the risen Jesus. And plus, these people going out looking for aliens and Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster, whatever. I mean, ghosts. These people usually aren't killed or are really willing to die for what they saw. I mean, we don't see anybody who's going out looking for Bigfoot. Our government is not threatening to kill them or torture them or imprison them if they say anything about Bigfoot. No, in fact, if you see Bigfoot, you'll get some money, you'll get a TV show, right? We encourage people saying those kinds of things. That's a completely different situation. This is what was going on here a couple thousand years ago. The government was threatening to kill, to torture, to imprison people talking about Jesus. Yet they were doing it anyway. They were willing to die for their testimony that Jesus rose from the dead and that they experienced him. They touched him. They had conversations with him. They were willing to die for it, and many did. if you really want to know what happened, you must always look carefully at the facts. And that's what we've done over the past few episodes or past few lessons here. So we've already looked carefully at all the historical facts about Jesus' death. So you still have to say, you have to ask yourself this question: what do you think is the best explanation of the historical facts? Now, I'd really like to encourage you to do more research of your own regarding the historicity of the resurrection and the historical person of Jesus. Dr. Craig has a good place to start, a chapter that he wrote in his book called On Guard. I recommend that. It's a good, if you want just a little chapter on the subject, that's really good. But then I encourage you to look at a book written by Mike Licona and Gary Habermas. And yeah, you've got it here. The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Did yours come with a little computer disk in the back?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that thing is awesome. Here, let me show it to The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Written by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. Highly recommended. This is a great book to start with. And yeah, there's a little disc in the back here. The Resurrection Challenge. You can put it in your computer, and it's like a game show host comes on, and you're a contestant on a game show, and he's asking these questions, and you can answer them and win the game. It's pretty cool. And while you're answering, you're learning how to have these conversations about the historical resurrection. It's pretty cool. Thank you. Now, that's a good place to start, but if you really want to go deeper and delve deeper into this topic, Mike Licona has also written what I consider to be the standard on the historical resurrection, and that's just called The Resurrection of Jesus. And it's about an 800-page book, but it's very thorough. Highly recommend it. I think, I consider Mike to be, the guy to go to when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. So, let's review the argument one more time, and then I'm going to add just a little bit to it. So, once again, the argument goes like this. Premise 1, there are some facts that need an explanation. 2, the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. 3, if God raised Jesus from the dead, then God exists. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. All right, so there's our first 4 steps, but now we're going to add to it. Step 5, if God raised Jesus from the dead, then Jesus is who he said he is. 6, if Jesus is who he said he is, we should worship and believe in Jesus. Final conclusion, 7, therefore, we should worship and believe in Jesus. And why? Because if God raised Jesus from the dead, then Christianity is true. And if you want to correspond to reality, well, truth corresponds to reality. So if you want to correspond with reality, which isn't that a good thing? You should worship Jesus. Here's the thing. In this final argument here, we've got an argument for the resurrection, a historical argument for the resurrection, then an argument for the existence of God, and then for the truth of Christianity. So I encourage you to rewind, watch that argument again, take notes. But if God raised Jesus from the dead, then some form of Christianity is true. And there's definitely other important issues, but that's what you start with. William Lane Craig gives a great example of a spider web. And so at the core of the spider web, it's God's existence. Then the next strand out is the resurrection. And then, you start getting out farther and farther, and you get into things like baptism and, the whole God's sovereignty and human freedom debate and things like that. These are all more peripheral issues. Spiritual gifts, what spiritual gifts are they around today? Are they not? I mean, we can argue about those. But, if you pluck out one of those strands, say you're a strong Calvinist and it turns out Calvinism is false, right? Which I think it is. But you take one of those, you break that strand, well, it might send a reverberation through the entire spider web. You'll feel it. But But Christianity, the web of Christianity is still true, you see. It's still there. But if you go to the center of that spider web and you pluck out God's existence or pluck out the resurrection of Jesus, well, the whole thing just collapses and falls apart. So, you see, so my point is, as C.S. Lewis called it, mere Christianity, that's the core of our web of beliefs, if you will. The cool thing is we have very good evidence, many arguments, pointing to the existence of God, and a historical argument showing that Jesus did rise from the dead. It was a real event in history. So you see, it's not just a blind faith that Christians have. No, it's a reasonable faith. We have reasons to believe what we believe. And that belief is quite encouraging. You know, just being encouraged doesn't make it true. But when things happen to be true, and then if they are really true, that gives you inspiration and encouragement and hope. Well, that's just great. You know, it reminds me of Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians 4. He says, we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him, those who have died already. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And after that, those who are still alive and are left will be caught together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage each other with these words. Encourage each other with these words. You see, because Jesus rose from the dead, we have encouragement to carry on. Because Jesus rose from the dead, so can you. Think about that. Because Jesus rose from the dead, so can you. Your life doesn't end at the grave, you see. If this resurrection is true and the historical evidence points to the fact that it is true, you see, if that's true, your life does not end at the grave because Jesus did it. He defeated death. And so he defeated your death too if you accept his grace and his love. Don't resist it. Don't resist him. Don't reject him. He wants the most for you. He loves you. Your life does not have to end at the grave. You see, but think about the other end of the spectrum here. There's no hope if this isn't true, especially on atheism. Think about atheism here. It's dust in the wind. I mean, if atheism is true, there's no legacy you're going to ultimately leave. Sure, maybe you can leave a legacy that people might remember for a few short years. But ultimately, everyone dies. Everyone. Including the entire universe. I mean, scientists tell us that left to our own naturalistic devices, the universe will be destroyed, utterly destroyed, and every person in it. You're not going to leave a legacy. No one will remember your name if atheism is true, ultimately speaking. You know, that was what Achilles was worried about. He wanted people to remember his name forever. On atheism, that doesn't happen. But then I think of the movie Gladiator. What does Maximus say? He's inspiring his troops. He says, "What we do now echoes in eternity." Well, that's only true if God exists. And I would even say if Christianity is true. I would argue that. But think about, on atheism, like I said, it's just dust in the wind. And that makes me think of the great philosophers in the band known as Kansas from the 1970s. When I grew up with, I remember being a little kid. I had these little records, these 45 records. That's how old I am. And I would play, it was the first record, little 45 single is what they called them. And my dad bought me this record. First song I ever had, Dust in the Wind. And I think he got me The Devil Went Down to Georgia also. That's one of the two songs I remember. But it's good theology. And in that song right there. But Dust in the Wind is a song from an atheistic perspective, really. And he's right. If atheism is true, we're nothing more than dust in the wind. Look at this line that he says. All we do crumbles to the ground, though we refuse to see. That's what you're left with on atheism. Everything you do is going to crumble to the ground, even if you refuse to see it, even if you refuse to think about it. Everything we do, if atheism is true, crumbles to the ground. It's destroyed. Sure, become president of the United States, big deal. Ultimately, that's nothing. It's going to be destroyed, and no one will remember your name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah, they might remember it a little bit longer than they'll remember me, but ultimately, you leave no legacy. Sure, become a doctor or a scientist and cure cancer. Cure all humanity from cancer. That'd be great. But guess what? We're all going to die anyway. And so are you. If atheism is true, your life ends at the grave, and you might just extend people's lives for a few more years, maybe a few more decades, but ultimately, we all die anyway. And if your life ends at the grave, that's meaningless. But that band of philosophers known as Kansas also wrote another song called Carry On My Wayward Son. And that song seems to have been written with a different worldview in mind. And it's a lot more positive. They sing this: now your life's no longer empty. Surely heaven waits for you. Think about that. Now your life's no longer empty. Surely heaven waits for you. You see, heaven is waiting for you. Jesus loves you, and he defeated death. And the historical facts demonstrate that that's true. He defeated death, and heaven waits for you. God the Father loves you. Jesus says in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father in heaven but through me. And I'm telling you this. God, Jesus loves you and desires you to spend eternity with him in paradise. He loves you. You might be watching this right now. I know there's atheists out there watching me, because I'm friends with a lot of you guys. And I know you watch me. And you might say you don't even believe in God, but I know you might even say you hate the idea of God. You hate the idea of Christianity being true, which doesn't make sense to me, because everybody would love everybody if we all followed the teachings of Jesus, even if we disagreed with each other. But you might hate the idea of God for some reason. That doesn't mean he doesn't exist. And you might hate the idea of God, but he still loves you. He still loves you. He desires a personal relationship with you. Heaven waits for you. And because of that, the things we do now aren't meaningless. As Maximus says, the things we do now echo in eternity. If that's true, if Maximus was right, then the things we do right now actually have meaning and purpose. Now your life's no longer empty because Jesus rose from the dead. Surely heaven waits for you. I'll tell you this. The only people who don't go to heaven are the ones that just don't want to go to heaven. I believe that ultimately it's your choice. But I do know this. The creator of the universe loves you more than you can imagine.